This morning we're going to talk about the grace side of truth and grace. As we started last week, we talked about the truth side of truth and grace. And then we're going to talk about ephemeral channel design and some low-cost innovative ideas for ephemeral channel design. So before we get started, just going to start out with a prayer. I'll give somebody about 5 seconds. If somebody wants to start, I'll let you. If not, I'll just say something quick. So. Dear God, we're thankful for this time together. We're thankful for the relationships and the experiences that you've blessed us with. Help us to be able to see the glory that you've given us in this creation. Help us to be in awe and wonder of the natural world this week. Help us to walk in humility while others are walking in pride. Help us to be able to put others forward when it's easier to put ourselves forward. We're thankful and we love you. Amen. All right. So, as I said, today we're going to talk about, we were talking about truth and grace for this week and last week, and we're going to talk about grace and what grace means. And with this, I'll share a little bit of my personal journey with grace. So, grace, if you try to look up what grace is, you're going to find out that there's a lot of different definitions of grace. People say, hey, you act graceful when you ice skate or when you roller skate or you don't fall down. Oh, hey, we're going to give you a grace period, so a period where you don't have to repay things. And I want to kind of talk to you a little bit about what grace is at its core. You know, grace is kind of the opposite of karma. We think of karma sometimes as, okay, well, you do something good, then eventually it's going to come back to you. You do something bad, it's going to eventually come back to you. But grace is basically saying, you know, karma is, you know, is it's all we get what we deserve, you know, and grace is saying we get what we don't deserve. The difference between, you know, grace, getting what you don't deserve, and being unfair is grace, you get something a lot better than what you deserve. Grace is possibly the most important concept in the Bible or in people that follow Christ, and it's clearly expressed in the promises that are revealed in the scriptures, as well as what has been embodied by Jesus while he was here on earth. Grace is the love that God shows to the unlovely, the peace that God gives to the restless, and the unmerited favor of God. So in other words, God gives us something we don't deserve, we couldn't earn, we could never deserve, but he gives it to us anyways. Philip Yancey, an author, said, grace is like water, flows to the lowest part. So in other words, we can only really experience grace when there's something in our life that's low enough to be able to receive grace. If we think that everything's pretty amazing and that we're doing everything great and perfect, it's hard for us to receive grace. Heard a pastor say a couple weeks ago, truth without grace is mean, and grace without truth is meaningless. And I would keep a question mark at the end of that when I say grace without truth is meaningless. But what the pastor had meant at the time, I think, is that you can be really graceful towards somebody, but if you never let them know what truth is, then you're being kind to somebody, but yet you're not sharing with them what ultimately is truth. So I'm going to share a quote from Paul David Hewson. He said, I believe we're moved out of the realm of karma into a world of grace. In other words, we're moving out of this idea of you're going to do more good for somebody and then you'll get good in return, or do bad and you'll get bad in return. We're moving towards grace. You see, the center of all religions is this idea of karma. Do more good for somebody and you'll get good in return. Or if you're bad, then eventually you're going to get what's coming to you. You know, what you put out comes back to you, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Or in physics, you know, we think of the physical laws of saying every action is met by an equal and opposite reaction. I've heard people refer to the idea of the laws of thermodynamics as being just a physical karma. It's clear to me karma is at the heart of this universe. So in other words, you push one way, you're going to get a response in the other way. But then along comes this idea called grace, and it just upends all of it. All this, as you reap, so you will sow type of stuff. Grace defies logic. It defies reason. Why should I get something good when I have not been good? Why should I be loved when I have a hard time loving? Why should I give love towards somebody if they can't love me in response? Love interrupts, if you like, the consequences of your actions. So in the midst of us feeling, hey, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that's where love comes in and says, hey, what can we do to love somebody else? And Paul David Hewitson, a.k.a. Bono, ended up saying, which in my case, this is really good news because I've done a lot of stupid stuff. So I like the end of that quote. But the idea is grace shows up where we're not good enough. Grace shows up at our lowest points when we can't do it on our own, and then we can fall on and realize that God's given us the grace to show us love even in the midst of ourselves. Ungrace, I think of Sam Eagle in this patriotic time coming up here. He's a Muppet, and he's all about being right, being fair, being good. And those are all good things, but ungrace essentially says it means you lack grace. And if you lack grace in ice skating, that means you fall down a lot. If you lack grace while riding a bicycle, that means you fall down a lot while riding a bicycle. Karma is basically the sum of a person's actions in this previous state or existence, and it's viewed as kind of deciding their fate for future existences. And this idea of karma, it's spread through a whole bunch of different religions and faith. But what grace says is that at some point, even though you don't deserve it, you're going to be given a gift anyways, a gift of love, a gift of grace. It's hard for me to believe this by this world. I used to think, hey, I'm going to try to be fair. And my goal in life was to be fair, personally be a responsible individual and be fair with others. And that was my goal. But when I failed at being fair, I'd become unfair. I think grace is a step higher, because if your goal is grace, you can try to be graceful to others. And when you fail at being graceful, a lot of times you fail to the idea of fairness, not to the idea of unfairness. But grace isn't being fair. Grace isn't being right. Grace is allowing yourself to be loved or love even when it's not deserved. Grace is love, is the love of God shown to the unlovely, the peace of God given to the restless, and the unmerited favor of God. We'll go through one of the most famous sins. Most people that have been in a Christian faith, at the beginning of this talk, you heard the bagpipes, and most people would recognize that song as being Amazing Grace. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of the man that first wrote Amazing Grace. And they're a pretty interesting story compared to kind of some of the things that we're going to right now related to race relations in the U.S. So John Newton was born in 1725. He was born in England. His mother died when he was 6 years old from tuberculosis. He was raised by a stepmother that didn't care much for him, kind of like this fairy tale evil stepmother, and he was abused as a child. At age 11, he decided to join his father, who was a sailor and a captain on a ship. Uh, as he was growing up from age 11 on a ship, you can imagine he watched a bunch of sailors and he became very headstrong and disobedient. He was kind of your typical drunken sailor. Um, his disobedience forced John to have to go into the Royal Navy, or else he'd have to go into jail because of doing things that aren't documented exactly what they were, but they weren't good. He deserted the Royal Navy shortly after joining the Royal Navy. Obviously, you're humiliated when you desert the Royal Navy in England. It's not a good thing, and it can get you in a lot of trouble. His dad forced for him to be able to be traded onto a crew of a slave ship. So at that point, he was taken on the crew of a slave ship, and slave ships weren't as good as regular merchant vessels. If you were on a ship, you could make a lot of money as a slave ship captain, but the people that worked the slave ship weren't exactly highly regarded, even at that time in the late 1700s in England. This is when he began his career in slave trading. So he would basically buy and sell people and work the slave trade. You know, at that time, he took a lot of trips from Africa to North America. He used to make songs and poems to make fun of his captain, and he'd create these obscene poems and songs, and he was disobedient and kind of obnoxious, if you will. He swore like a sailor. Well, he was unliked by many people on the ship because he would write songs and poems, and he'd say bad things about people, and I imagine he was just kind of annoying. He was imprisoned and he was chained at sea, and then he had to work in Sierra Leone as a prisoner slash slave, and he had to work there for a number of years until his father heard about this through a letter, and his father still had some pull, and he moved, and he was able to move John Newton to a different slave ship's crew. Being a captain of a slave ship, of course, his dad was able to kind of pull strings for him. He was married at 25 in 1750, and his wife's parents did not like him much because he was kind of a troublemaker, but they eventually allowed him to get married. He eventually became the captain of a slave ship, and he took a lot of trips on the middle route between Africa and North America. John became a tax collector in 1755 when he retired from slave trading, which also wasn't exactly a well-renowned position. In 1964, he was ordained as a priest in the Church of England. He wrote a poem from personal experiences related to slave trading in 1772 that was known as Amazing Grace. And then in 1779, they stole the tune New Britain, and they put Amazing Grace to the tune New Britain, and that's the current song that we know as Amazing Grace. At age 63, after being a pastor for 24 years, John Newton finally found enough courage to break his long silence on slave trades. He wrote a publication that was shocking to people in England at the time called Thoughts Upon the Slave Trade. You can imagine being 24 years as a clergyman, as somebody that's trying to point people towards Christ, and you have 24 years that you don't say a single word about something that you're so ashamed of in your past. And he described the horrific conditions of the slave ships during the Middle Passage from Africa to South America, through the Caribbean, up to North America. And he had said that a confession, which he later said comes too late in life, it will always be a subject of his humiliating reflection to himself, that he was once an instrument in the business that is now my heart shudders at. So in other words, there's this humility that fell upon him. And when he wrote this idea of amazing grace, it's only when we can feel the lowness of who we are that we can actually receive how amazing God is to love us and want to have a relationship with us, even though we are not worthy, even though we are just beggars and a ragamuffin at the feet of an almighty God. Before John Newton died in 1807, he worked on the Slave Trade Act with William Wilberforce, another abolitionist, and he became an abolitionist that eventually led to ending the slave trade. And of course, that led to the Caribbean uprising, which then eventually led to uprise of slave trade and the Underground Railroad, where the Quakers and Methodists had really put into case, and then eventually led to succession of South Carolina and the Civil War and freedom for the slaves. I think the amazing thing about this story is without John Newton's story, he would have never been able to experience grace. Without your story, without your pitfalls, without those sins that you wish you didn't do, those sins that keep you up in the middle of the night, those sins that you hope nobody ever finds out about, without those pitfalls, grace will never flow like water and rush into your life. So as much as we can be ashamed by these situations of our lives that we wish we weren't a part of, they're a part of our story. They're a part of how God can show his grace. Bill Clinton was raised a Southern Baptist. He was, of course, president of the United States. I grew up hating Bill Clinton because my parents hated Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton had a question. He was interviewed by a guy named Philip Yancey for a magazine called Christianity Today. And Philip Yancey was at the height of the evangelical movement, basically a Christian political religious movement that had started in the 70s. He was at the height of this religious evangelical movement, and he was interviewing Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton had an amazing quote that he had asked to Philip Yancey. I believe it was in 1995. It says, "I've been in politics long enough to know criticism and hostility, but I was unprepared for the hatred I would get from Christians. Why do Christians hate so much?" Now, Bill Clinton was a Christian. He grew up in the Southern Baptist Church. I don't know what his journey was like at that time. I don't know if he was trying to follow Christ at that time, but he was definitely a Christian. He practiced the culture. Philip Yancey, the author of a book that he later titled "What's So Amazing About Grace," Philip Yancey said, "Although there are many reasons for evangelical Christians to approve of Bill Clinton's policies, his lifestyle, hating him is not a valid option for a Christian." We are never called to hate anybody as a Christian. The entire gospel is about God loving us so much that he gives us this grace that we could never deserve or could never earn, but he gives it to us anyways because he loves us. He gives us this grace so freely, and we turn around and we think we can hate somebody else because we have truth that they don't see. Of course we have truth they don't see. We're always going to have some truth that somebody else doesn't see, but that doesn't give us an option to hate. Grace is the church's greatest distinction. The church without grace is nothing. There's no reason to follow Christ if we don't have grace towards others. If I can't show grace towards somebody that I disagree with, then why do I even claim to be a Christian? I'm not following Christ. Christianity is not just a culture. It's not a country music song. It's not just a way that we can feel good about each other and increase our securities here on life. It's not just a nice way that we can have a bigger 401k. It's not just a way to find a business that has a fish at the end of it so that they can do work and other people can't do work. It's not a country club. Following Christ is a relationship that takes everything in our life, but yet we never deserve it. We can never once earn the love of God. It's always a free gift of grace. It's the one thing the world cannot duplicate. The Berlin Wall came down because of grace. The Berlin Wall didn't come down because of a military action. Grace is the one thing that the world craves above all else. For only grace can bring hope and transformation to this jaded and cruel world. The world is hurting so much. The world needs us to show them grace. We all need grace, but yet we feel as if we need to show them truth. We can give truth, but we need to show grace. We need to be the example of grace in this world. Paul says in Ephesians, for it's by grace you are saved, not through works, through faith, let me try this again. For it's grace you have been saved through faith, and it is not by yourself. It is a gift from God, not by works, so that no one can boast. We're entering a season of pride. We're in a month of pride, of course. I think I've talked about it before. July 4th is going to be a big period of pride. If you're in Canada, July 1st will be a big period of pride. But Paul says it's not by works, it's not by what we've done, so that no one can boast. 2 Corinthians 12:9-10 said, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. When we feel weak, when we know that we're not worthy, that's when God's power through us is perfected. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That's why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardship, in persecution, in difficulties. For when I am weak, I am strong. It's because grace that we can say that my hardships, my persecutions, my difficulties are what makes me strong in life. It's not because I'm so great. It's not because I did something so amazing. It's not because I know something so much better than anybody else knows. It's because of God's grace that we can find strength. So, what can I do with this grace today? We can extend it to others, and that's hard to do. That means when somebody else messes up, does something you wish they didn't do, takes more of your time to try to fix it, we can show grace towards them. We can tell them that they're loved even though they didn't do exactly what was needed. We can find ways to help teach people and guide them in truth, opposed to alienate them from the truth. I would say one of the other things we can do with grace is we can extend it to ourselves. We get to the point where we get beat up by shame. I have a close friend of mine that's been blackmailed by, he texted me yesterday, he's blackmailed because in a low point in his life Saturday night, he made some really bad decisions related to sexual type of things. And I don't know the entire detail, but in shame, he allowed himself to do things he wished he didn't do. But the story to him is, well, you're low, you're humble, you're at the feet of a righteous Lord, you're a beggar. Now grace can enter into you. And grace is saying, I'm a loved child of God. I'm a beggar, I'm a ragamuffin, I'm nothing, but at least I'm humble and I'm at the feet of a righteous God. And that righteous God loves me dearly, more than I could ever love myself. And the final thing is, in talking to my mother-in-law yesterday, we were talking about sins of race at the kitchen table, and we were hearing a sermon, And one of the things that I would say is related to the Mississippi flag, and there's some neat commentary on the Mississippi flag I encourage you to read if you have time. But extend grace to those who came, and I said came before us, came before us even after they're gone. Live in humility, not shame. I have grandparents that all encouraged me to be racially biased, if not racist. And I loved them all dearly, and they loved me dearly, and they were a gift and they were a blessing from God. But they encouraged me to be racially biased, uh, and or be racist. Most of them are dead. Only one of them still alive. Um, and for me to look back at them with anger or shame or even pride is a miss of the mark. I don't have to live in shame. I can be humbled by the fact that I was raised in a way that missed the mark. Whether that means that I was raised in a sin to an addiction, whether that means I was raised in a different ideology, whether that means I was raised in something else. But even there, God's grace was able to reach me. And we can extend grace to others. You know, I think about the Mississippi flag right now, and knowing that you have a heritage of something doesn't mean that we have to hold on to that same opinions that occurred in that heritage. We can love our heritage and we can care deeply and be thankful for our heritage while not holding on to the shame, while not holding on to the pride that we have assumed associated with that heritage or those opinions that have been done in the past. Every single one of us on this call has been wrong and will be wrong today at one thing or another. We all have opinions that aren't right. We should not be worshiping the opinions of our ancestors when we see them to be wrong. Well, we shouldn't be worshiping when we see them to be right either, but we have to allow the shame and the pride associated with the opinions of our ancestors to pass by us. But we need to extend grace to them. We can still show love. They were just wrong. I'm wrong every day. That's no big deal. They had different circumstances. So with that, I'll open up to thoughts and questions. I said we were going to be done with race stuff, but I felt the need to add this at the end, so I might be beating a dead horse. I'm sorry for that if I am.
Yes, Ken. I think it's pretty awesome. Mississippi is changing that flag. I didn't think it would happen, but it's happening.
Yeah, I do too, Ken. It amazes me. Thank you. Dear God, we know we're not worthy, but you love us anyways. Help us to love the unworthy. Help us to love those that we think are our enemies. Help us to seek your face when we look upon others. Help us to love the racists. Help us to love them in spite of what they say, in spite of what they do. Help us to just be an example of your grace and love in this world. We know the world needs it. And we know that that's what our place is in this world, to just extend your grace and love towards people. Help us to do it in truth. Help us to not be shy about what the absolute truth is in our life, but help us not to be confused of relative truths. We're so thankful for these relationships and experiences and this time you gave us together. Thank you for this week. Thank you for this world. Thank you for friends. Amen. All right. Sorry, it's taking me a little bit this morning, guys. Ken, you're such a blessed man. I love you so much, man. For the people on the line, Ken came to us in the middle of my struggle with ideas of grace. And Ken, beyond more than what you'll ever know, you've taught me so much about grace. And God showed me so much about grace through you. And I'm so thankful for that. Our daughter, who was born the same exact time that we were hiring Ken, and actually Ken was born because Ken was hired because of the lack of my ability to fulfill commitments because of my daughter being born. My daughter, Viola, reminds me of my journey in grace as we were blessed to be able to name her Viola Grace. So whenever we're angry, we yell at Viola Grace. We go, Viola Grace. And it's a reminder to act in grace towards Viola. What a blessing. Thank you, guys.
Love you too, Dave.